It is so good to be with all of you today. As Dave said, my name is Emily. I am a member of this church, but I have been attending over Zoom during the pandemic, so I'm waving to all of my fellow Zoomers, and I've only been here once a couple weeks ago to worship in person. So I just want to take a minute to look around and take in all of your beautiful, still masked faces. And to let you see mine unmasked, which feels really strange. And I am looking at the choir and appreciating your beautiful gifts. And at Dave, for the joy of this place of joy, that this church and the community, our ongoing worship together in a myriad of creative ways has been, for me personally, and I'm guessing for many of us, throughout the pandemic so far, because as Dave said, it's not over, and I'm so glad we're telling the truth about that. I work at the hospital and as a chaplain, but mostly as a chaplain educator, which means I support the students who, like me a few years ago, came to the hospital to learn how to be spiritual care providers. And they keep coming, even during a pandemic, to see what it is to serve and be served in a place that is hurting. And I brought my tissues, as a good chaplain does, tissues that are maybe softer and not so scratchy as the ones they provide at the hospital, because I feel tender-hearted. This is my first time preaching in person since before the pandemic. I just took my first trip leaving California to go back to the Pacific Northwest to see people who I love, where I lived for 19 years. And when I got to I was so nervous before I went. Was this a good idea? Was it not a good idea? And in the lift at the airport, I started to cry out of joy just seeing the airport. And I'm glad you're laughing, because I felt the same way. And when I got inside and I saw everybody, I thought, I missed everyone. I live alone, and I have been so diligent about sheltering in place, going to the hospital and back, going to the grocery store and back, meeting people outside, but not really being out in the world. And I've missed everyone. I've missed you all. I still miss singing together. We're still in the middle of it, and yet we are here together. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful to be invited to preach, which I love to do. Most of the time I spend listening and in conversation, and I see this as an extension of that today. Even though I'm the one with the microphone, I hope we're in an ongoing conversation with the gospel. And what I want to invite you into conversation about today is this gospel reading with our absurdly honest disciples, James and John, who are asking Jesus to do whatever they want him to do, like Jesus is a vending machine, which cracks me up, which I love about the gospel. And I think that my first reading of them treating him like a vending machine is wrong. So I want to dive a little bit deeper with this gospel that's still working on me, and I hope will still be working on all of us after we leave today. And I'm taking off my watch so I can look at it, because I was raised at a church where I was allowed to preach as long as I wanted. And that's not our culture here. And I want to honor that. And I want to talk about James and John, and I also want to talk about Peter, even though he's not mentioned, and Jesus. I want to talk about intimacy and the power of the human request. This is what the section of the gospel is titled, The Request of James and John. So intimacy and human requests, cups and contradictions, power and hospitality, love and humility, abolition and glory. And that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but it's what got stirred up in me. And I'm hoping we can just go through part by part together. So at the beginning of this passage, it kind of drops us in immediately with James and John's request. But just before this, Jesus has predicted his death. And this is their response. So when I went back a little bit in the gospel to see, oh, Jesus has just said he's going to be flogged and he's going to die. And their request is to come forward and say, okay, but Jesus, before you're gone, or maybe after, could you do whatever it is that we want? That would be great. And I thought, whoa, as a chaplain, like we just skipped over the really tender part here, that Jesus is going to die. But as I kept going further and further back in Mark, I realized that Jesus has predicted his death at this point 3 times. And it totally changed the way that I was thinking about James and John's request is maybe they believed him. Maybe they believed him and they had actually taken in what he had said. And they had just witnessed Peter earlier in Mark's gospel rebuking Jesus and trying to talk Jesus out of this call, this cup that Jesus had agreed to drink. And what does Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. So maybe James and John were thinking, well, that's not going to work. We better just get on board. And since we're going to get on board, I think we're going to ask for what we really want. For what we really want. Because James and John, along with Peter, are in the innermost circle of the innermost circle. This group of 12 disciples has some subsets, and they've been invited to some pretty privileged places. Along with Peter, they've been to see Jesus transfigured with Moses and Elijah. They've seen something that they can't quite explain, but it's done something to them about how they see Jesus and how they see themselves. Later on in the Gospels, Jesus asked them, Peter, James, and John, to go with him in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he knows he's just on the verge of being killed. And he says he is sorrowed to the point of death. He's grieved, and he wants people to be with him. And these are the 3 that he has chosen. So with that intimacy, as we do in our intimate relationships, or I hope we do, we are bold. We are honest, even if it sounds ridiculous, to our partners, to our siblings, to our family members, to my boss. I have asked for what I've wanted. And Jesus, with curiosity, models for us not retribution or rebuking like he did with Peter, but curiosity. What is it that you want me to do for you? What is it that you really want me to do for you? And they say, grant us to sit. And before we get into the right hand and the left hand, I just want to stop there with grant us to sit. In my creative imagination, I am imagining them saying, we want to be close to you. We've seen what happens to you, around you, among you, and what has happened to us. At this point, we're pretty close to the end of Jesus' 3-year ministry. There's one story after this in the Gospel of Mark. A blind man is given sight, and then it's our version of Palm Sunday, the triumphant entry. So they've seen a lot. And they're asking, grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory. In your glory, not in theirs, but in his. This transfigured light that they've seen, if I read it in a generous light, which I'm inviting us to do. But Jesus said to them, well, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? And to my surprise, they replied, we are able. We are able. All of us were given a cup to drink at the beginning of this pandemic and invited to sit close while sitting apart. And we didn't know what we were getting into or how long it would go on, and we still don't. But we have shown up and shown that we are able to receive this cup and be together. That's our particular invitation at this time. At that time, for James and John, James is the only one that we hear about that actually was beheaded after Jesus was crucified. He meant what he said. Then Jesus said to them, "Okay, I'm taking you at your word. The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. Dunked in belovedness, steeped in love, and this cup will be offered to you, and you will drink it." And what I love about these calls on our life is they're full of contradictions, which Jesus models for us. He wanted to give that cup back. So he might sound confident all the time, but we know from this view into the Garden of Gethsemane that he even says, "Take this cup from me if you can. It's your will, not mine. But if it was up to me, I would give it back." I don't know how many of you feel totally relieved by that, but I do. To see Jesus's humanity, to see the struggle means that I'm allowed to struggle, that you're allowed to struggle, that we're allowed to struggle with the things that we are called to. It doesn't have to be clear and easy all the time, and it's not. And he goes on to say, which surprised me, "But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. I want to go back to that, but just remember that line, "But it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. Not Jesus got angry with James and John, but the 10. And then Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But it is not so among you." So he's not mad at James and John, and he's responding to the anger of the 10, saying, it can be different among you. It can be different among us. Power over versus power with. Let's do it a different way. He goes on to talk about servants, and this first will be last, and this, if you want to be first, you must be slave of all. And I just want to get rid of that completely. I hate that we have the word slave that we say from the pulpit, and then in some churches would say the word of the Lord. Well, that was the word of that time. But I don't think Jesus wants us to continue with a slave mentality. No one should be a slave to anyone else. And this is what I want us to consider about reversing, not first and last, last and first, but what would it look like to dispense with that system altogether? To be host and guest. To be guest and host. To go back to this contradiction of Jesus saying, "I am with you as one who served." But in a few gospel chapters, he is going to be served and anointed, lounging at a table. What if that is the kind of relationship and intimacy that we are being invited into? The power to ask for what we want, the boldness, the willingness to receive the cup that we're offered, to not be a slave of anyone and not to be a slave, expect anyone to be a slave to us, but to be in a relationship of mutuality, one in which we will serve, one in which we will be served, one in which we will be the host, one in which we will be the guest. Is this the kind of glory that they saw, that they wanted to be a part of? Transfigured by love, by intimacy, by a knowing, up close and personal, of some things they didn't want to see, and of some things they did. If you knew this kind of love was for you, that you were indeed baptized with the same baptism that Jesus was baptized with, what would you ask for? What would you be so bold as to request? Is there an intimacy that you long for with Jesus? That would fill you with the kind of power, not over, but with, that would help you to imagine that so many more things were possible, even in the face of death and suffering. There is this kind of love.